Chapter 35 of the Hand of Fu Manchu. This recording is in the public domain. The Hand of Fu Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 35 The East Tower. With a cigarette between my lips, I sat at the open window, looking out upon the skeleton trees of the orchard, for the buds of early spring were only just beginning to proclaim themselves. The idea of sleep was far from my mind. The attractive modern furniture of the room could not deprive the panelled walls of the musty antiquity which was their birthright. This solitary window, deeply set and overlooking the orchard upon which the secret stair was said to open, struck a note of more remote antiquity, casting back beyond the carousing days of the Stuart monarchs to the troublous times of the Middle Ages. An air of ghostly evil had seemed to arise like a miasma within the house from the moment that we had been disturbed by the unaccountable rapping. It was at a late hour that we had separated, and none of us, I think, welcomed the breaking up of our little party. Mrs. Oram, the housekeeper, had been closely questioned by Smith, for Homopoulo, as a newcomer, could not be expected to know anything of the history of Graywater Park. The old lady admitted the existence of the tradition which Nayland Smith had in some way unearthed, but assured us that never in her life had the uneasy spirit declared himself. She was ignorant, or, like the excellent retainer that she was, professed to be ignorant, of the location of the historic chamber and staircase. As for Homopoulo, hitherto so irreproachably imperturbable, I had rarely seen a man in such a state of passive panic. His dark face was blanched to the hue of dirty parchment, and his forehead dewed with cold perspiration. I mentally predicted an early resignation in the household of Sir Lionel Barton. Homopoulo might be an excellent butler, but his superstitious Greek nature was clearly incapable of sustaining existence beneath the same roof with a family ghost, hoary though the spectre's antiquity might be. Where the skeleton shadows of the fruit trees lay beneath me on the fresh green turf, my fancy persistently fashioned a black-clad figure flitting from tree to tree. Sleep, indeed, was impossible. Once I thought I detected the howling of the distant leopards. Somewhere on the floor above me, Nayland Smith, I knew at that moment, would be restlessly pacing his room, the exact situation of which I could not identify because of the quaint rambling passages whereby one approached it. It was in regard to Karamaneh, however, that my misgivings were the keenest. Already her position had been strange enough, in those unfamiliar surroundings, but what tremors must have been hers now in the still watches of the night, following the ghostly manifestations which had so dramatically interrupted Nayland Smith's story, I dared not imagine. She had been allocated an apartment somewhere upon the ground floor, and Mrs. Oram, whose motherly interest in the girl had touched me deeply, had gone with her to her room, where no doubt her presence had done much to restore the girl's courage. Graywater Park stood upon a well-wooded slope, and to the southwest, starting above the trees almost like a giant Spanish priest, showed a solitary tower. With a vague and indefinite interest I watched it. It was Monkswell, an uninhabited place belonging to Sir Lionel's estate, and dating in part to the days of King John. Flicking the ash from my cigarette, I studied the ancient tower, wondering idly what deeds had had their setting within its shadows, since the Angevin monarch, in whose reign it saw the light, had signed the Magna Carta. This was a perfect night, and very still. Nothing stirred, within or without Grey Park. Yet I was conscious of a definite disquietude which I could only suppose to be ascribable to the weird events of the evening, but which seemed rather to increase than to diminish. I tossed the end of my cigarette out into the darkness, determined to turn in, although I had never felt more wide awake in my life. One parting glance I cast into the skeleton orchard, and was on the point of standing up, when, although no breeze stirred, a shower of ivy leaves rained down upon my head. Brushing them away irritably, I looked up, and a second shower dropped fully upon my face and filled my eyes with dust. I drew back, checking an exclamation. What with the depth of the embrasure, due to the great thickness of the wall, and the leafy tangle above the window, I could see for no great distance up the face of the building, but a faint sound of rustling and stumbling which proceeded from somewhere above me proclaimed that someone, or something, was climbing either up or down the wall of the corner tower in which I was housed. Partially removing the dust from my smarting eyes, I returned to the embrasure, and stepping from the chair on to the deep ledge, I grasped the corner of the quaint diamond-paned window, which I had opened to its fullest extent, and craned forth. Now I could see the ivy-grown battlements surrounding the tower. The east wing, in which my room was separated, was the oldest part of Graywater Park. Sharply outlined against the cloudless sky they showed, and the black silhouette of a man's head and shoulders leant over directly above me. I drew back sharply. The climber, I thought, had not seen me, although he was evidently peering down at my window. What did it mean? As I crouched in the embrasure, a sudden giddiness assailed me, which at first I ascribed to a sympathetic nervous action, due to having seen the man poised there at that dizzy height. But it increased. I swayed forward, and clutched at the wall to save myself. A deadly nausea overcame me, and a deadly doubt leapt to my mind. In the past Sir Lionel Barton had had spies in his household. What if the dark-faced Greek Homopoulo were another of these? I thought of the 45 port, of the ghostly rapping, and I thought of the man who crouched upon the roof of the tower above my open window. My symptoms now were unmistakable. My head throbbed and my vision grew imperfect. There had to be an opiate in the wine! I almost fell back into the room. Supporting myself by means of the chair, the chest of drawers, and finally the bed rail, I got to my grip, and with weakening fingers extracted the little medicine chest which was invariably my travelling companion. Grimly pitting my will against the drug, but still trembling weakly from the result of the treatment, internal and subcutaneous, which I had adopted, I staggered to the door, out into the corridor, and up the narrow, winding stairs to Smith's room. I carried an electric pocket lamp, and by its light I found my way to the triangular, panelled landing. I tried the handle. As I had expected, the door was locked. I beat upon it with my fist. "Smith!" I cried. "Smith!" There was no reply. Again I clamoured, awakening ancient echoes within the rooms and all about me. But nothing moved, and no answering voice rewarded my efforts. The other rooms were seemingly unoccupied, and Smith was drugged. My senses in disorder and a mist dancing before my eyes, I went stumbling down into the lower corridor. At the door of my own room I paused. A new fact had suddenly been revealed to me, a fact which the mazy windings of the corridors had hitherto led me to overlook. Smith's room was also in the east tower, and must be directly above mine. "My God!" I whispered, thinking of the climber. "He has been murdered!" I staggered into my room and clutched at the bed rail to support myself, for my legs threatened to collapse beneath me. How should I act? That we were victims of a cunning plot, that the deathful Si Fan had at last wreaked its vengeance upon Nayland Smith, I could not doubt. My brain reeled, and a weakness, mental and physical, threatened to conquer me completely. Indeed, I think I must have succumbed, sapped as my strength had been by the drug administered to me, if the sound of a creaking stair had not arrested my attention, and by the menace which it conveyed afforded a new stimulus. Someone was creeping down from the landing above, coming to my room. The creatures of the Yellow Doctor, having dispatched Nayland Smith, were approaching stealthily, stair by stair, to deal with me. From my grip I took out the Browning pistol. The Chinese doctor's servants should have a warm reception. I burned to avenge my friend, who I was persuaded lay murdered in the room above. I partially closed the door, and took up a post immediately behind it. Nearer came the stealthy footsteps, nearer. Now the one who approached had turned the angle of the passage. Within sight of my door he seemed to stop. A shaft of white light crept through the opening, across the floor and on to the wall beyond. A moment it remained so, then was gone. The room became plunged in darkness. Gripping the Browning with nervous fingers, I waited, listening intently, but the silence remained unbroken. My gaze set upon the spot where the head of this midnight visitant might be expected to appear. I almost held my breath during the ensuing moments of frightful suspense. The door was opening, slowly, slowly, by almost imperceptible degrees. I held the pistol pointed rigidly before me, and my gaze remained fixed intently on the dimly seen opening. I suppose I acted as 99 men out of 100 would have done in like case. Nothing appeared. Then a voice that seemed to come from somewhere under the floor, snapped, "Good God, it's Petrie!" I dropped my gaze instantly, and there, looking up at me from the floor at my feet, I vaguely discerned the outline of a human head. "Smith?" I whispered. Nayland Smith, for indeed it was none other, stood up and entered the room. "Thank God you are safe, old man," he said. but in waiting for one who is stealthily entering a room, don't, as you love me, take it for granted that he will enter upright. I could have shot you from the floor with ease. But mercifully, even in the darkness, I recognized your Arab slippers. "Smith," I said, my heart beating wildly, "I thought you were drugged, murdered. The pot contained an opiate." "I guessed as much," snapped Smith, "but despite the excellent tuition of Dr. Fu Manchu, I am still childishly trustful, and the fact that I did not partake of the crusted '45 was not due to any suspicions which I entertained at that time." "But, Smith, I saw you drink some port." "I regret to contradict you, Petrie, but you must be aware that the state of my liver, due to a long residence in Burma, does not permit me to indulge in the luxury of port. My share of the '45 now reposes amid the moss in the tulip bowl, which you may remember decorated the dining table. Not desiring to appear churlish by means of a simple feat of legerdemain, I drank your health and future happiness in claret." "For God's sake, what is going on, Smith? Someone climbed from your window." "I climbed from my window." "What?" I said dazedly. "It was you? But what does it all mean? Karamaneh—" "It is for her I fear, Petrie, now. We have not a moment to waste." He made for the door. "Sir Lionel must be warned at all cost," I cried. "Impossible," snapped Smith. "What do you mean?" "Sir Lionel has disappeared." Chapter 35